So then we get to Rodrik himself, the author of this trilemma. He's an Harvard academic. He's a professor of international political economy at Harvard, and he has this laid out in a series of blog posts. This is probably not the original venue which he used, but it's useful now. It's available to everyone.
I'm surprised that people at Harvard are actually doing useful things. I mean, I thought they're too busy screaming about oppression.
Yeah, some of them are. but so he's the one who gives the example of the globalization and national sovereignty bundle as the 19th century gold standard straitjacket. It comes from him. That's what he says is a good example of what he means within this dilemma. And then Rodrik himself seems to be pro Bretton Woods compromise, like this kind of third. So national sovereignty and democracy, but limited globalization. And so let me just read one of the quotes from the original article. So he says it was quote, a limited version of globalization, which is what the post-war Bretton Woods regime was all about, with its capital controls and limited trade liberalization. It has unfortunately become a victim of its own success. We have forgotten the compromise embedded in that system, and which was the source of its success. So he says, we had this limited globalization, and because it was limited, we made it work so that we could have democracy and national sovereignty both. But since then, we have tried to increase globalization, and that's what you can't have if you have the two, and that's why there's a lot of tensions in political and economic cycles.
Sure. Right? And I would imagine that would be like post-70s sort of when things
post-Cold War, I think.
Post-Cold War,
yeah.
Okay. So even later than that.
I think like post-70s is monetarily because the Bretton Woods system.
That's what I had in mind. Yeah.
But then geopolitically, at the end of the Cold War, because you had like the New World Order right coming in, and like the end of history ideas, and
that sounds really sinister.
And so, like by now, it's become like a conspiracy theory thing, New World Order, but it was a legit political term back then. It was It was like the new setup of the world after the end of the Cold War, right? And so then it became really pronounced that what people wanted was more globalization, or not necessarily the people, but the people who run things. So more globalization was kind of sought. And therefore, according to him, this tension arose between that and the two ideas of national sovereignty and democracy that we still wanted to keep in place. Right? And so then elsewhere in Harvard Magazine, Rodrik has there's a quote saying. Right, yeah. That Rodrik has long argued that what he calls hyperglobalization, which is eliminating essentially all barriers to the movement of goods and money around the world, has succeeded in undermining the ability of countries to govern themselves and allowed multinational corporations to set the rules for the economy. And so we can kind of see what his political position is within all this. Like he's kind of a left-leaning liberal, let's say, or like something like that. He's not exactly aligned with the political economic consensus after the end of the Cold War. He's saying, okay, if we do all this, this is not going to work because there is this tension, which is this trilemma, and so this is his idea. That's where he stands. He would like to limit globalization in order for us to be able to keep national sovereignty and democracy. Right? And so then he has another blog post from 2016 where he talks more about the political trilemma, and he says that globalization and technocracy are often conflated in public debate. That sometimes you have people saying, okay, these bureaucrats doing these technocratic decisions on supranational scale is globalization, but that's not necessarily it. He says like globalization has a lot of things to it. This is just like one part of it that can be a part of it, but it might be more important, less important, but it's not the whole picture.
Sure.
Right. And then he says that the trilemma, that's kind of an important point that he mentions. The trilemma is not nothing or everything. You can have all three in limited extents. Right? So that's why he says he prefers the Bretton Woods Compromise, because you can have sovereignty and democracy to a large extent, and then you can have globalization to some extent, but you can't have it to the full extent, because then the tensions start rising.
That certainly seems like the position I'd be most inclined towards, because otherwise you sacrifice either your ability to self-govern or have any democratic principles, which I would see is leading to greater problems than if you limit globalization. Perhaps you might miss out on, a little bit of money, but it's about being able to have an effect on politics that I think most people are concerned about necessarily.
Yeah, and that actually goes into the next thing I want to talk about,
Okay.
which is it's interesting that giving up that kind of, with these things, you have the option to do two things, but giving up democracy is never considered an option, right? so you have people that like support giving up globalization. You have people that support giving up national sovereignty, but you don't really have people that support giving up democracy. And so in the Harvard magazine, the Rodrik's position supporting the Bretton Woods Compromise is kind of summarized. So I think it's a bit down there. It's so quote, hence this trilemma. One, a nation can be democratic and sovereign, but it cannot be hyperglobalized. Two, it can be hyperglobalized and democratic, but then it would have to give up its national sovereignty to a global government. Or it can be sovereign and hyperglobalized, but then it would have to abandon democratic accountability. So his preference is to abandon hyperglobalization. Quote, I do think there is something special about the nation state, he says. It creates reciprocal obligations that don't exist across national borders. And so it's not him writing this. This is the author, Marina Bolotnikova, her framing, but it is representative of his own take on things as well. And so when we talk about whether having globalization is justified or desirable, it is kind of automatically weighted against sovereignty, and that it as that would be the only one that kind of would be needed to be given up, and the option to give up democracy is never considered. And so that's how.
Do you have any idea why? I mean, obviously, I know why I wouldn't, but that there must be some kind of discussion as to why they've kind of got that one off of the table as being compromisable.
Well, I think that the idea has been really like ingrained in us and in Western society as something that is good, something that is desirable, something that is often synonymous with the good. Like people often equate democracy with what they imagine to be good, right? And the discussion is sometimes just about democracy is what I like and what I don't like is not democracy, right? Which is why I wanted to specify in the beginning what we're talking about when we're saying democracy, because then people talking about whether human rights are part of democracy or minority protections are part of democracy, and that's kind of pointless, because that's okay. I know you like those things, but it doesn't mean it's democracy, right? And so that's kind of, I think that the reason is that it is very very ingrained, and we're kind of we grew up in these systems,
Sure.
and it's kind of what we know and what we see as good by default.
I think just my psychologist perspective is that it's a key kind of foundation for self-actualization, like reaching your kind of desired end goal of the person you want to be in, and having control over that is a key part of that. And part of having control over your life is having control over what you can do, which means that democracy is a key part of that.
Yep, and that's I think what the general idea is among most people around us. And so this was kind of a summary of the argument, of the theory, and what an explanation of what he thinks and what Rodrik thinks as well. And we also talked about a little bit about why he thinks things like that. And so I want to present my own take on it, because which part of it you prefer, which combination of two out of those three things you prefer, depends on your ideology, depends on your preferences, different, like on your political leanings as well.
Sure.
So I want to give my own take, like what do I prefer, right? So I think that which out of the three, what's desirable is the combination of globalization and sovereignty, and so why do I want to forgo democracy to maintain those two and not any other way around? I think that if you take it in the historical context, democracy, it's a relatively recent idea that democracy is the only way to have kind of self-governance or political expression of yourself, right? So I don't see it as that at all. Like I see it as a venue for competing interests to be competing groups to be pitted against each other and kind of compete for resources and for power. And so there's this kind of an arena where people just battle it out and conflict is created. So you have the power that is supposed to be given to the people through democracy, right?
Sure.
But I think that's a complete fiction that you don't have people governing themselves. That's never the case, or the majority. You always have an oligarchy or an aristocracy that runs the place. So you can have a pretense of kind of voters or majority having the final say, but it's never going to be that. It's always going to be some kind of smaller group doing something because it's I think it's part of the natural course of things and natural kind of tendencies for people to differentiate themselves and to create hierarchies.
Sure, but I don't necessarily agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that democracy is important because it allows people to discuss and come to compromises about their kind of ambitions and their goals for themselves without having to resort to violence. Like if you can't work out a compromise within a society, the ultimate end goal is that there's going to be some form of political violence. There are going to be groups with shared interests being pitted against one another just by merit of it being human nature to be that way.
I agree with you, but you're making the assumption that democracy is the only or the proper way to do it, and that
Sure.
and that it actually helps the conflicts rather than exacerbates them, right? So what I'm saying is that because everyone can kind of everyone can affect a lot of things if they're ambitious enough, and if they do all of these things within democracy, if they engage with the political system, you have this kind of strife for power that is very destructive. It has been described as like a low intensity civil war, right? And so it's obviously it's better than high intensity civil war.
I would say
but
so.
At the same time, it is a far cry from something that would be otherwise desirable, right? If you want to have a society where you discuss things and come to an agreement, like having a low intensity ongoing conflict is not the solution that I would kind of see as desirable.
Sure, but your kind of argument is assuming that there's always going to be a high amount of conflict in a political system, whereas I feel like that's not necessarily inevitable. You can have groups that have very different beliefs, but still understand that compromising and working together is still better. I know you said that it's not necessarily a democracy thing, but I feel like the democratic systems in place really help that, although sometimes they might not. For example, first past the post kind of pits people against one another. The electoral system, that is, in that it amplifies the voices of the two major parties and marginalises any others. But you can still have democracies where things function perfectly well and people are able to use the political system to come to compromises that they wouldn't otherwise. But I'd be interested to hear what your alternative would be.
Yeah, I think that what democracy does is I completely agree with you that you have these people with different groups with different interests with different goals, and I think what democracy does is to pit these groups against each other, because they ultimately compete for resources, and excuse me, they compete for the option to rule over the other group, right? That's the ultimate price of democracy. And so this kind of compromise that you're talking about, I don't think that happens. I don't think that can happen in democracy, just because of the way that the game is played, not that how the system is set, but how the actual kind of power relations happen in the political system.
Okay.
And so I think that another option of what democracy can be is this kind of a venue for a crowd of people or a multitude of people to take rights away from the minority, right? That's another worry,
There's
right?
a good quote that I like to use that refers to, particularly the democracy in the UK, as an elective dictatorship.
Yeah.
In the majority tyrannize the minority of people.
Exactly, and the dictatorship of the majority, or tyranny of the majority, is a fully fledged out concept.
I think I'm quoting Lord Hailsham off the top of my head, but I'm not certain.
It's something that is very well known. Tyranny of the majority is a concept that is widely acknowledged, and obviously people are not ignoring it. But I think it's very important in democracies, because that's what they ultimately lead to. So people like to use what I said a while back was that people like to equate democracy with everything they like human rights and minority protection, things like that. But those are things that are barriers to democracy, right? So if you have the majority deciding on, okay, we want to oppress homosexuals or something like that, right? Then then you can say, okay, you can't do this. This would be unconstitutional. This would be against human rights. These things are to protect you against the majority, protect you against democracy. And so because my primary aim is to protect human rights or uphold human rights. That's my primary motivation in politics, and my secondary motivation is to expand material wealth. So the first priority is to protect human rights, and then second priority is to make everything work well, so that people can get wealthy and they can get good things and have a nice life, right?
Sure.
And so I'm against democracy, because democracy goes against both of these, right? So that's my main take.
I understand your argument now, yeah.
And so I would end it with I would end my argument with a quote from Hans Hermann Hoppe, who says that democracy is a soft variant of communism, and rarely in the history of ideas has it been taken for anything else. I think that's absolutely true. But yeah, as I said, this was my take, and people can have different takes on the trilemma and choose different combinations of two out of the three things based on their political leanings, based on their ideology, and that's what many people have done, and they've argued whether you can actually have all those three or can't, and that's up for discussion still.
Sure. But I definitely understand what they are now, all these three things, how they're defined, how they can be compromised, and also which compromise I would probably make myself.
That's good. I'm happy with that.